Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is titled Deadly Pre-Ground Proximity Warning Systems, etc. Era. This is the crash of United 389 on August 16th, 1965. Now, this was a trip from LaGuardia to O'Hare. It left at 9:21 out of LaGuardia in the evening, so this is all during nighttime. And as they were descending into Chicago O'Hare, it's attributed to descending through what they thought was 16,000 feet when they actually were descending through 6,000 feet. Now, a lot of people nowadays, well, how could that have happened? You got the altitude alert, you got the ground prox, you got, the mode C readback, you got the altitude alerter. Back then, they didn't. And there was another big issue, too, was the three-pointer altimeter. Now, this is the three-pointer altimeter that was used at the time, and if you're not familiar with one of these, that's a great thing because they caused a lot of problems, and they're attributed to a number of accidents. In fact, the Naval Research Laboratory did a study in January of 1965, that's when it was published, that this altimeter was 8 times more likely to be misread than the 3 other circular altimeters that were in existence at the time. And that is what this accident is attributed for. They simply misread this altimeter. The yellow arrow points to the 10,000 foot altitude marker. When that's on the 1, you're at 10,000 feet. And you also got the hash below in the altimeter. But even with that, this altimeter was 8 times more misread than other altimeters. And there were several other preceding accidents that were attributed to misreading this altimeter. Now, this was the first hull loss for a 727. The 727s had been in service for about 2 years. They started out with Eastern. This was the first hull loss and the first 27 lost by United Airlines. It wasn't the last that year. The second one was the crash at Salt Lake City, which I've discussed in another video. Now let's talk about the ground proximity warning system. If this system had been on the aircraft, it would have saved the aircraft, basically. I met Don Bateman many times back when I was doing the new Aircraft Valuation Certification Committee work, and he is the guy that brought this forth, and he saved thousands, if not tens of thousands of lives with this. But the original development occurred in the 1960s, and this system was pretty basic. It would do things like it had a radar altimeter, so if you were close to the ground, it would tell you, and it had decent rate warnings and things like that. But it didn't have the terrain database yet. That was a later feature that came about. You could be flying into a cliff and you wouldn't get a ground proximity warning. And there were a few accidents with that, even though they had the system. So this system was developed, but the ones you're flying with now, of course, are much more sophisticated than even the earlier ones. But even the early ground proximity warning system would have saved this aircraft. Now, this is the profile. They were basically stepped down coming into Chicago, and the final clearance was down to 16,000 feet. And like I said, they feel the crew misread it. Now, I guess they were probably busy too, because the weather was actually, it was like 8,000 foot overcast, but it was kind of and not very good visibility. They supposedly could see the shoreline lights. They were out over the water, but they were essentially night VFR, which is, one reason night VFR is dangerous, among other reasons. But anyway, they might have had a chance, to see things, but they could have been busy preparing for coming into Chicago, and they just missed looking outside and seeing it. And this was an era when pilots tended to look outside a lot more than they do now. So let's talk about the basic 727-100, which this was. United actually called them, and the airlines kind of tailored their airplanes at the time with Boeing fairly specifically. So this was called United 727-22. And later on, we dropped that designation. That's a little bit of trivia there. But the yellow arrow points to the three-pointer altimeter there, and you can see with the hash marks, we're below 10,000 feet here because we're essentially setting on the ground. The red arrow points to the ground proximity warning system. And again, this is one of the more basic ones that didn't have the terrain database. Now let's move ahead here, and we've got a couple enhancements. The yellow arrow now points to the more standard round dial altimeters that came about later, and they actually existed at the time, but they weren't in wide use. But this is the one that, 22,740, you're not going to miss that. And the green arrow points to the altitude alerter. This was a system that was also not in place at the time. We had a lot of things that could have helped here. And of course, you got to give US Air a lot of credit for their finger pointing, and that doesn't come across in a derogatory manner. They came out with this thing that when you set the altitude in the little window there, you point to it. And you do that on the mode control panels and everything like that. At first, that kind of silly. But, when the one guy points to it and then the other guy points to it until, you both confirm that, yeah, that's the altitude, that actually turned out to be a pretty good system. They knew what they were doing there. So here we got the ground proximity warning system that was on the 727, and of course there were situations where it would warn you of improper configuration, and at times certain emergency landings you had to turn that off. And there's also the altitude alert system depicted with the audio and oral warning there. Now, it was interesting. In the 60s and the 70s, there was an average of one controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, accident per month. And of course, those have virtually gone away. All right, so let's talk about safety enhancement that didn't exist at the time that could have really helped these guys out. Oh, by the way, this is why I don't want artificial intelligence to fly my airplane anytime soon or to take pilots totally out, because I asked it to draw me a picture of a 1960s United Airlines 727 over Lake Michigan, and this is what came out. Okay, paint scheme's wrong. It hasn't been able to get that right yet. Tail sort of looks like a 27. But those engines on the wing, okay, this is a 5-engine 727. Boy, this thing would have scooted. Okay, anyway, I digress. Let's talk about the safety enhancements that did not exist at the time. There was no ground proximity warning system at the time, and they were having one CFIT accident in the 60s and 70s a month. One CFIT accident a month. That system wasn't mandated till 1974. There was no altitude alert system in there. No little instrument that you dialed in the altitude you were going to, and it gave you oral warnings approaching. Now, for most airliners, it's a 900-foot warning. For my Cessna, it's 250 feet. We didn't have this on the T-38, and they told us that if you were going to level off from a afterburner climb, you should lead it by 10,000 feet. So I guess if you had one, you'd get that altitude alert 10,000 feet early. That would get your attention. Okay, there was no mode C. So when you told center what your altitude was, they assumed that that's what your altitude was because they had no way of verifying it. So that would have led to, that would have averted the accident also, because they would have said, hey, guys, you're not at the altitude you think you are. And they got some information on this flight from a military radar called a SAGE system that could give height information. But this was a military radar, and it wasn't tied into the air traffic control system, so those two weren't linked together in any fashion. So ATC had no idea what altitude these guys were at other than what they reported. And the other thing that may seem shocking, there were no CVRs. Those were not mandated until March 67. So one thing that really hampered the investigation, and why a lot of this is just speculation, is because we had no idea what the guys were talking about, what they may have been discussing, what they thought the altimeter said, where they thought they were. We have none of these. And, a CVR can be a very obviously valued safety enhancement. Now, they did recover the flight data recorders. Those were in the mud. They actually recovered the tape. It was done on kind of like an aluminum foil at the time where things were scribed. They didn't actually recover the unit, but they did recover the foil. And then the other thing, of course, is the confusing altimeters, which they were gradually done away with, and they still exist. You can still have them in light airplanes and things like that, but with an 8 times misreading error, if you've got an aircraft that moves through a lot of airspace, that is significant to be a factor. So anyway, that's a little history about safety enhancements that today we take totally for granted, and back in the day, virtually any one of these could have possibly prevented this accident, but none of these existed. So, I hope you enjoyed this, found it informative. Thanks for watching.